The world champion Zhu Wenjun starts the game 3 of the championship match against the challenger Tan Zhangui with the move e4. Tan Zhangui leads the match 1.5 to half and responds with c5. And like in the first game, we have a Sicilian defense. Hope you stay for the whole video to see the queen sacrifice, bishop sacrifice, and a great endgame technique. Knight f3, e6. This is the same as in the first game. In the first game, Zhu Wenjun played d4. But in this game, she decided to play another move, c4, because in the first game, she didn't get any advantage for white in the opening she chose. After c4, we have knight c6, strike in the middle with d4, exchange of the pawns on d4. And in this position, the most popular move for black is to develop the knight on f6 and attack the pawn on e4. Instead, Tan Zhangui plays bishop b4 check. Computer doesn't like that move because after bishop d2, white has a pretty good advantage in this position. But without thinking even a second, knight c3 for the world champion. So she decided to go into this position, knight e7 for black, developing the bishop on e2, striking in the middle with d5, couple of exchanges of the pawns on d5, exchange of the knights on c6, and castle. Castle for white, castle for black, pawn exchange on square d5, bishop f3. The opening part of the game is pretty much over. What did white achieve? They achieved the isolated pawn on d5. And white game is gonna concentrate on trying to win that pawn. Bishop e6 to protect the pawn. Bishop g5 pinning the knight to the queen. Bishop takes c3, pawn takes c3. Now white has an isolated pawn on c3 and black has an isolated pawn on d5. What white have in this position that gives them a very slight advantage? They have a pair of bishops. In open positions, this is usually better than the knight and the bishop. Rook c8, attacking the pawn on c3, queen a4, counter-attacking the pawn on a7. So if rook takes c3, queen would take on a7. h6, challenging the bishop on g5. Bishop goes back to d2 and protects the pawn on c3. Now the pawn on a7 is actually under attack. Tan Zhangui protects that pawn with the move a5. The rook goes on an open file rook e1, rook c4 challenging the queen. The queen goes back to a3. Doesn't look really... looks pretty awkward on that square, but nothing special. And knight f5. Visually, black's position looks a little better at this point, with very active rook, very active knight. But computers consider this, the engines consider this position still even. Bishop retreats to e2, attacks this rook on c4. The rook retreats to c8, and another rook joins the action for white, rook d1. Queen d6 offering the exchange of the queens. Instead, the world champion decided to take the pawn on a5, winning the pawn for exactly one move, because after rook a8, the queen has to go somewhere from the attack, and it goes to b4, and rook takes a2. White plays bishop f4. It's not advantageous for black to take the queen on b4, because after the exchanges of the queens, the pawn on b4 becomes very, very dangerous passing pawn. With the support of the bishops, it could really create problems for black. Therefore, Tan Zhangui does not exchange the queens and moves the queen to c6. Bishop b5 attacking the queen, queen goes to b6, and a rook e2 offering the exchange of the rooks. It's important to notice here that the bishop protects the rook on e2, and if the exchange of e2 happens, the queen on b4 is still protected by the pawn. So white are not losing anything. Black doubles up on a file with the other rook, rook a8. Bishop goes to d3 again, offering the exchange of the queens. And here comes rook a1, sacrificing the queen on b6. And computer considers this a brilliant move for black, but I'm not sure I agree completely with that, because obviously if you take the queen on b6, you're gonna get checkmated on the first rank very easily. So therefore, and after bishop f1, there is rook a1, and you cannot protect the bishop, and black would win this game. And very good for them that the king can escape and there is no checkmate on the 8th rank for white. Therefore, obviously, the world champion doesn't take the queen on b6 and plays rook e1. Exchange of the rooks on e1 and queen d8. h3. Now the white king has a luft, and there is no danger to receive a checkmate on the first rank. Queen f6, rook e1, rook c8 attacking the pawn on c3, bishop goes to e5 attacking the queen goes to g5, and it looks a little dangerous for white here, because if there is no knight here, the pawn on h3 would be already under attack because of the spin. And finally, white bishop starts slicing black's position, attacking the rook, attacking the queen, attacking the rook, and a rook d1, attacking the pawn on d5 with a bishop and a rook. Queen g5. Queen g5, seemingly giving up on the pawn on d5, but after bishop takes d5, and that's what white played, Tang Jianghui has a very beautiful tactical shot. Knight e3. Knight e3. And now, if white takes the knight, then simply bishop takes d5. Black is without a pawn, but very dangerous position for white, with checkmate on g2 is a real threat, and black is definitely not worse in this position. And if white decides to take the bishop, then they will be simply checkmated in one move. Queen takes g2. Therefore, Zhu Wenjun played h4, very careful, attacking the queen, queen g4, exchange of the queens on g4, the knight is still under attack by the pawn, but the rook is now under attack by the bishop. Therefore, the rook is more important, the rook goes to d3. Knight takes d5, rook takes d5. This is another phase of the game, where we have an endgame of a rook against a rook, bishop against the bishop, 4 pawns against 3 pawns. What's important, the bishops are of opposite colors. Dark square bishop for white, light square bishop for white. Normally, those type positions are a draw, despite the fact that white has an extra pawn. Very difficult to make any progress. The way to make some progress in this position for white would be to activate the king and to get the king into the action, to the middle of the board, and very slowly but surely white are gonna achieve that. Rook a8, bishop b6. I'll go quickly here because the moves are not that important. Both players are just shuffling the pieces, but here we have first achievement for white. The king went to f4 and already getting closer to the opposing camp. King d7, g3, so everything very careful. Rook goes to a5, rook b4, bishop d5, attacking the rook, rook a3, protecting the pawn with king d4, bishop e6. Again, a lot of moves. Nothing really happening. White has a very slight advantage due to the fact that they have an extra pawn, but opposite square bishop pretty much guarantees that black would be okay in this game and it will end in a draw. Attacking the pawn on f2, protecting it was the move by the king, because now the bishop protects the pawn on f2. Check, king e3. bishop e6, more moves, c4, finally some progress. The passing pawn made 2 moves forward. Nothing really changes in the evaluation of the position, it's still a draw. And here, black makes the first inaccuracy. They place the bishop on d5. And the best was to play bishop d7. All very subtle differences, very difficult to understand exactly why bishop d7 would be better than bishop d5. You have to be really like 2600 level to really see all those subtle differences. Tan Zhenghui didn't really see it, played bishop d5. King went to f4, and now another mistake, bishop c6. And this move, again, allows the king to penetrate to the very important squares in the opposition's camp for white. And this position is already much better for white, but still not easy to win. Rook a4. Now, if white exchanges the rooks on a4, this position would again be a total draw. Therefore, bishop e5 check, king d7, rook b2, avoiding the exchange of the rooks. King e6, bishop f4, attacking the pawn on c5, protecting the pawn on c5, and black plays king e5. So black activated their king and seemingly have no problems holding off this passing pawn, but in reality their position is already lost. Rook b8, bishop d7, rook attacking the bishop, bishop e6, and again this maneuver of the rook, and now the rook is in a very active position on d6 to protect the square c6 to allow the pawn to move forward. Not immediately, of course, because if now c6, then the rook on d6 would be hanging. But again, very slight improvements. And now black's position is lost. Rook c2. King goes to h6 and infiltrates into black position from the square g7. So remember, the king was on g1, went to h2, and then this was the trip, and very successful. King f6, not allowing the king to go to g7. Rook comes back to d1, comes back to d6, check, and f3. And now it's interesting that black king is already without any moves. So if black is not careful and they play, let's say, bishop c4, then we have a checkmate in one move. Black obviously doesn't allow checkmate in one move, and they play rook c4. But now the pawn already marches forward. c6, king g7, g5, exchange of the pawns, and bishop b6. Bishop b6 to protect the square c7, so now the pawn can move even further. King f5, c7. White achieved a lot. The passing pawn c went all the way to c7 and 1 square away from promotion, although it's not so easy as of right now because both the bishop and the rook are protecting the square ca. Also, white king is already in the opposing team territory. And after rook c3, white plays bishop a5. And now black cannot take the pawn on f3 because the only protector of the square c8 could be just eliminated by sacrificing the rook, and after black takes the rook, it would be c8 promotion to the queen. Therefore, black plays rook c5, attacking the bishop, rook a6, protecting the bishop on a5, black plays rook c4, king goes to f8, the journey continues, and now king e7, and black cannot take the pawn on f3 because it would be answered by rook f6 check, king g4, and rook f4, forcing exchange of the rooks. And after rook takes c4, c8, queen. White wins again. So black answered with h4, trying to create some counterplay on the king side of the board, but that's too late. And actually, this move h4 created another passing pawn for white, because after first of all check, king e5, and g takes h4, rook cannot take the pawn on h4, because again, rook has to be glued to protecting the square c8 from promotion. Bishop e6, h5, and the pawn just marches forward, and now white has two passing pawns, and black cannot hold both of them. Rook c5, h6, another brilliant move for Zhu Wenjun, sacrificing the bishop on a5, but again, if rook takes a5, then the rook takes e6 with a check, and queen. White would easily win. Therefore, after h6, black plays bishop c8 and resign after Zhu Wenjun plays the last 87th move of the game, h7. Black cannot protect themselves from not allowing white to promote on a square h8. So this game was 87 moves, with some brilliant moves, with some sacrifices, and really one mistake by Tan Zhenghui. Really one mistake. And that mistake happened, I'll go quickly here. So black in this whole endgame made one mistake. And even that mistake, I'm sure it's not so immediately clear to understand why this was even a mistake, but that move, bishop c6, pretty much made the position very difficult to hold for black. And before that move, in this particular position, that was still a draw. The best move for black, by the way, was here rook e2 or rook a6. Both moves continued the game, and it was a draw position. And bishop c6, seemingly a very basic, easy move, made this position winnable for Zhu Wenjun, and she brilliantly used that opportunity, won the game, and now the score in the match is 1.5 to 1.5 after 3 games.